Hello there, Rev Divers. We've got another fantastic guest for you today. Today we're talking to Jenny Jacobson. She's the Senior Advisor at Silverstone, which is a Hub International company. But what's really most exciting about Jenny is that she works in the cybersecurity area, but from the operations side, meaning something we can understand a little bit better. And so we begged her to let us pick her brain today, and she actually agreed. Jenny, we're so excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
We
Hi,
are
Jenny.
so excited. Right now, cybersecurity breaches are happening almost daily, or even more often than daily, it feels like, and particularly in the healthcare industry, whether that's just because we're behind the curve or for whatever reason. But it seems to me that a lot of these are stemming from third-party service providers, like lots of breaches from third-party service providers. And from a liability perspective, since you can speak to that realm, what does that look like for facilities? Like, how do they keep themselves safe from third-party breaches?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The bad actors have really targeted third parties and those service providers because they know if they hit that group, it has a greater impact than going directly to hitting only one organization. And so that's really made those third parties a target. When we look at liability, what the general rule of thumb is whoever collects the data is responsible for securing the data. That doesn't mean that you can't outsource that. That doesn't mean that you can't use other third parties to, host your data or as software as a service. But it does mean that you have to take some extra steps to make sure that your data is secure with those folks. So it's really important when you're looking at your liability that you have a vendor management process to make sure you're looking at those vendors so you know how they're securing your information and that they're doing it at a level that you would secure your own information. Other questions that you want to ask that create liability is, who has your data and where is it being stored? Around the globe, there's a lot of different regulations and rules about data privacy and protection. So if you're using a local company in the United States, but they're storing and hosting your data in Europe, you may be required to follow European data privacy laws. So knowing where your data is can be a source of liability. A lot of this can be attacked, if you will, or addressed in the contract language. Most third service providers are going to be looking at limiting their liability. So there's a lot of times nothing you can do about that, but knowing what the contract says and who has liability and where the liability falls is really the biggest part of that equation. Then the last piece when looking at liability is you want to make sure that there's a defined process if there's a breach. So if that third party has a breach, how soon do they have to notify you? Who's going to respond and notify individuals if there's a legal or even an ethical duty to respond and to let folks know that their information was breached? So those are areas that we look at for liability when dealing with third parties. Like I said, a lot of times there's nothing you can do about the limitation of liability, but knowing where the liability is most of the battle.
Wow, that's really, really good insight. Thanks for sharing that, Jenny. We're also looking at, a lot of organizations dealing with employee burnout, not just physicians, but C-suite and, the ancillary staff, especially, folks who are working and doing multiple jobs, wearing multiple hats. If you think about it, and I'm sure you have thought about this, that creates liability, right? Especially for our remote workforce, right? For the staff who are working in the office and maybe they keep their username or, their access up over a long period of time. And, with the way that the daily operations work, sometimes someone else will kind of log in. I mean, there's a lot of, opportunities for risk when you're dealing with employees who are kind of getting to that point of burnout. Are you seeing that type of liability in the industry?
What we see is really more of a shortage of talented IT folks. And we've known that the industry has been short on talent for several years. And with the current state of not only burnout, but just the industry as a whole, if you will, we see people in IT taking other opportunities. They're not stuck in their job. They have endless opportunities. As tools become more automated, IT tools, I'm referring to, more AI and behavior driven analytics tools, there's a lot more bells and whistles where it is more like monitoring reports and checking to see if everything is okay, as opposed to maybe being in the weeds and actually doing cybersecurity like you once did in the past. That's really burning out folks, just sitting and looking at those lists. So where we're seeing that is that those folks are leaving the direct organizational companies that they're working for, which is then forcing our organizations to outsource those duties more than they ever have before.
Yeah, it's causing so much strain on the industry, but also on the other staff, because you have so much productivity lost whenever you lose an employee who's been there for a long time. Or I work with a group right now that is like, well, so and so always did it, and for pretty much every question I have, well, so and so always did it. Do you have a process for this? We do, but so and so has it or had it, and there's so much loss there. When you tie that into things like this new term that I keep hearing, which is poor cyber hygiene, the impact is huge. And I saw Health IT Security was speaking just this week, or last week, I think it was, about the weakness of passwords and things like that, right? Just the length or how you're formulating those passwords. So when you think of like ideal cyber hygiene, like what comes to mind for you? Because this is a newer term for me, cyber hygiene.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic across the field right now is passwords. Passwords are no longer that holy grail of cybersecurity like they used to be. They're tired of passwords. We're tired of changing our passwords. I tried to order a smoothie this morning off of an app from my local juice stop. And I couldn't even log in because I couldn't remember my password. So I think we've burnt people out on passwords. What we have seen and what the data shows is that passwords are important, but there's more important pieces to cybersecurity. So when I think of cyber hygiene, I think of it in kind of two different buckets. You have your personal cyber hygiene, and this is every employee has to be responsible for themselves and looking out for the good of the company. So they need to, think before they click. That was a big promotional cybersecurity month slogan a few years ago. Knowing what you're clicking on, changing passwords, using strong passwords, not sharing your password, but also just taking responsibility to know that this is important and what's at risk here. The second bucket would be organizational cyber hygiene. And this includes a strong password policy requiring passwords to be a certain character length, as well as changing them, every 90 days or whatever that is for your organization. But it's a lot more than that. We know that multi-factor authentication is one of the strongest ways to protect your organization. And as a part of that is a password typically. But there's also the other factors that even if someone steals your password, they can't get past. They can't get past your face identification. They can't get past your having your cell phone to actually accept and authorize access into a system. So, having multi-factor authentication in place at a minimum for remote access to your networks, for email servers and access, for privileged accounts, for backup solutions. That's where MFA is really, really important. Another piece of a good cyber hygiene is making sure that you don't have any open remote desktop protocol ports, so RDP ports. When those are open facing and anyone on the internet can essentially access that highway into your systems, it's really hard to protect against that. So making sure that those are closed and cleaned up. The fourth thing I would say would be having strong backups. What we are seeing is that the bad actors know that you're less likely to pay a ransom if you have a backup. And so what they're doing is they're actually accessing your backup first. They're copying, corrupting, deleting that backup before they hit your network and demand a ransom. So making sure that you have a good backup that's air gapped and accessible, and most importantly, that is tested. If you've never tested your backup, you don't know, especially when you're using a third party to host that backup. So making sure that that is in place. The next would be having strong solutions to help you with your network and email monitoring. So these days, it would be endpoint detection and response software, next-gen antivirus, email filtration system to identify those, maybe bad emails that are coming through your system to try to stop them before they actually get to your employees and give them the chance to click on them. And then the last and probably most important is just that continuous training. We know that we're only as strong as our weakest link. And so we have to continue to train folks, even at the risk of burning them out on that training. So those, when I think of good cyber hygiene, that's what I'm looking at for our companies.
And, Jenny, what's interesting is that we're seeing throughout the industry that email is really becoming one of those high, areas of impact when it comes to the bad actors. So the advice that you've given is super helpful. I really hope that we as an industry move to multi-factor authentication, especially for email. I know for me, it's not something that's like high on, on my to-do list, but I do understand that it's very important, and it's one of those, areas of vulnerability that we need to take seriously, right?
Right. And, from a cyber insurance perspective, that multi-factor authentication is something that the underwriters have placed a very high importance on. And so if you don't have multi-factor authentication in place, the chances of actually being able to get cyber insurance right now are basically slim to none. So,
and yeah.
So the insurance market is helping put that pressure on companies to step up their security measures, but they also don't want to pay for a claim that could have been prevented. And the numbers show that multi-factor authentication prevents claims or prevents emails from being hacked, which would then prevent a claim.
And Jenny, speaking of that, it's coming up, we're the beginning of the end of one year, moving into a new year. It's time to start renewing our policies. It's also a good time for us to start auditing ourselves and thinking about the processes that we want to have in place for a new year to keep our, our patients, PHI, and then even our business, information from a business continuity perspective. We want to keep all of that information secure. And we really do rely on our policies, right? Our cyber liability policies, our insurance policies. So having those strong relationships with those vendors is super important. We get, this question a few times a year. Is it worth the expense, right? To have cyber liability coverage? And, when we think about our rev divers, who are folks who are in, the financial kind of field and revenue cycle, can you kind of break down for us, is cybersecurity insurance worth it? And, is paying a ransom worth it? What should our listeners do when, if hopefully, if knock on wood, they don't actually have to deal with this, but if they do encounter something like that?
Yeah. So cyber insurance is definitely worth it. It's one of the few insurance products that you're likely to use. And it's come a long ways. I've been doing this for over 7 years now and focusing on this. So I've seen all the changes in the marketplace during that time. And it's a lot more than just an insurance product that you need after the fact. So carriers have really evolved into taking a more proactive pre-breach stance to help their insureds. And they're also taking more of a technical approach. So there's a lot of resources that they offer, either from the insurance carrier themselves, that can help you prevent those breaches, or they've partnered with reputable vendors to provide those third-party services to you for a discount. And if there's any space that needs a discount right now, it is for those outsourced IT services. They can get really, really pricey, and it's definitely a hindrance on our organizations when they go to implement different security controls. But it's a lot more than just, we have X number of patient data that was breached, and now we have to send out notifications. The IT forensics costs can be outrageous in determining what happened with a breach. Your policy is going to pick up that expense. Also, business interruption. One of the largest expenses I see with our hospitals is if their EHR, EMR is hit and they have to shut down a surgery suite. How many days of that surgery suite being shut down, and then those surgeries never being rebooked in the next 3 to 6 months, that's lost revenue. And that's lost revenue that's recoverable under a business interruption clause on your cyber insurance policy. So that can really tick up there, oftentimes to the 7-digit loss number. So it definitely is worth it, in my opinion. Our healthcare clients are our number one clients that I see that utilize cyber insurance. So if you have not been hit by a breach, you probably know somebody who has gone through that process. Speaking specifically to the ransomware, I used to throw out a lot of statistics. In the last 18 months, I've kind of put that to the wayside because there's no central repository of claims data. And there's so many different vendors who are helping with breaches, so many different insurance carriers. It's hard to tell if we have accurate numbers. But one number that I continue to see is less than 70% of people who pay a ransomware actually get their information back. So essentially a third of the people who are paying the ransom don't ever even get their information back. And this is becoming even more of a problem with what we had called double extortion. And this is where the bad actors are getting in, they're copying your backups, and they're saying, okay, well, don't pay us for the unencryption code, but if you don't pay us for the data, we're still going to publish your data. So they're hitting you with that double extortion attempt. Along with that, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, in the past year has issued 2 different guidances reminding us that we are prohibited from doing business with people who are on their specially designated nationals list, their blacklists. And over time, this blacklist has really grown to include folks in the ransomware gangs. And so anyone who does business with those folks, i.e. paying the ransom, can be sanctioned by OFAC. And that includes the insurance carriers, that includes banks, that includes the organization. So we really have created an interesting tug of war between an organization who they need their information back to be able to operate, or the possibility of having a sanction from OFAC. So we haven't seen it affecting whether or not ransoms are paid quite yet. I do believe we will see that coming into play, or especially coming into doing a little bit more due diligence of who's on the other side of those ransom demands, and can we say, with a level of certainty that they're not on that OFAC S&D list.
Oh my gosh, listen, I will definitely be replaying this episode because
Right? Wow.
Wow, I never thought that we could actually be sanctioned for paying a ransom, but I get it. I mean, everything that you said, just it makes complete sense. So really the overarching goal here is to be proactive, right? It is to be proactive so that you're not put in that position to make these decisions.
Right.
Well, Jenny, oh my gosh, thank you so much. This has been an enormous help to, I think, both Taya and I, to our audience, our Rev divers. You have so much experience, and we thank you so much for your time today. Until we meet again, Rev divers, thanks so much for joining us. Keep diving into those Rev cycles.